Many countries are nowadays crossed by multi-lane highways. In Europe, this enables cars to pass through several countries in a day. How different it was 110 years ago when the first true motorcar, Carl Benz's Patent Motorwagen, appeared on the streets of Mannheim, Germany in 1886. By the turn of the century, the motorcar was becoming a familiar sight in Western Europe and the United States. Nevertheless, it was still regarded as little more than a plaything of the rich. Capable of speeds of little more than 20 miles per hour, it was still very prone to break down. The roads of the day did not help, often being little more than deeply rutted dirt tracks. Yet with the new century barely 2 years old, German-born, French-educated but naturalized Englishman, Dr. E.C. Lewes, planned a highly ambitious motor journey in his 23-horsepower Panhard Levasseur. He set out from London's Hyde Park in April 1902, bent on driving around the world. A cross-channel ferry took Lewes and his car over to France. Passepartout, as he called his car after Phileas Fogg's servant in Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, was landed on French soil. Paris was Lewes's first main port of call, and he spent some time here before proceeding to Berlin. Here again he spent some weeks. He then motored through Posen and Warsaw and into Russia proper before Passepartout came to grief in a snowdrift near St. Petersburg. The following spring the car was recovered, brought back to Britain, and ended its days as a humble motor bus. But soon other drivers became aware of the automobile as a means of improving communications around the world. In July 1903, H. Nelson Jackson became the first man to drive across the United States. He set out from San Francisco in his Oldsmobile on the 23rd of May and arrived in New York just over 2 months later. Crossing Australia with its hundreds of miles of desolate outback was an even greater challenge. Yet a Mr. Dutton achieved a north-south crossing from Darwin to Adelaide, a journey that took him 9 months during 1907 and 1908. Then, in March 1912, Thomas Birtle set out from Perth and arrived at Sydney 13 months later to complete the first west-east crossing. Africa too presented a stiff challenge to the early motorist. Nevertheless, a German army officer, Oberleutnant Paul Gretz, crossed it within the first decade of the century. He set out from Dar es Salaam, in what was then German East Africa, for Schwarzkopmund, in Germany's other main African colony, in August 1907. Gretz experienced both adventure and much frustration, and eventually reached his destination 21 months later. But even in Europe, the going could be very tough, as Robert Jefferson found in 1905, when he drove his rover from Coventry, in the English Midlands, to Constantinople. It was the Balkans which proved to be the real problem, especially since only rutted tracks existed for roads. Nevertheless, Jefferson overcame every obstacle to reach his objective. At one point, Jefferson had to buy petrol from Prince Ferdinand of Bulgaria, since he owned the only car in the whole of the country. Jefferson's determination won through, and he reached Constantinople in just 36 days. But the great Peking to Paris motor race of 1907 stands out in the annals of motoring history. 5 cars set out from Peking, including an Itala, owned and driven by Italian aristocrat Prince Scipio Borghese. The cars first had to cross the Gobi Desert. The Itala soon proved its superiority over the other cars. Even so, it too had to sometimes rely on Chinese coolies to pull it out of difficulties. Primitive rafts were used to overcome rivers. The route then passed into Russia and followed the Trans-Siberian Railway westwards. Borghese sometimes used this as a substitute road. On one occasion, he overestimated the strength of a rustic bridge. But local peasants helped him to put the Itala back on the road. Crossing the Urals, Borghese now reached the greater civilization of Western Russia. Here, he and his crew were feted in every city they passed through, sometimes to his frustration as he wanted to press on. From Moscow, Borghese set off on the last major leg of the journey. The Itala was now on the better roads of Western Europe and arrived in Paris just 60 days and 12,000 miles since leaving Peking. 3 of the other cars also finished. Even more ambitious was the New York to Paris race of 1908. This took the competitors to San Francisco, Japan, and thence to Vladivostok, and across Russia and Europe to Paris. The Great War of 1914-18 saw significant strides forward in developing mechanical reliability and robustness. Notable were the performances of British Rolls-Royce armoured cars and Ford light cars in the Middle East. Among epic post-war expeditions was that in 2 Crossley tenders by Major and Mrs. Court Treat from Cape Town, South Africa to Cairo in Egypt. They set out in September 1924. As others did, they soon experienced the difficulties of motoring in the bush. Luckily, there were usually plenty of willing natives to be found to help get the Crossleys across rivers. Sheer muscle power was also required when the tenders became hopelessly bogged. Yet the expedition did eventually reach Cairo towards the end of January 1926, having driven 12,700 miles in 17 months. For the Court Treats, it was the trip of a lifetime. Indeed, once they'd got their vehicles back to Britain, they shared experiences with audiences all over the country. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the French army was interested in motor cars in order to strengthen its hold on France's possessions there. The firm of Citroën, in conjunction with engineer Adolphe Kegresse, designed a half-track vehicle. They took a group of these across the Sahara in 1922. The expedition was led in person by Citroën Director General Georges-Marie Hart. The vehicles quickly impressed the local French authorities with their ability to cross desert terrain. They each traveled some 2,000 miles with few mechanical problems, reaching Timbuktu in 53 days. So encouraged was Georges-Marie Hart that his half-tracks now mounted another expedition, this time across Central Africa. What those traditional ships of the desert, the camels, thought of their new rivals is not recorded. The terrain, however, was much more varied than the Sahara. The expedition also came across tribes which had seldom seen a European, let alone motor vehicles. At times, as other African motorists discovered, Hart had to rely heavily on local labor to help his vehicles overcome obstacles. As the half-tracks continued eastwards, they created excitement wherever they went. The river ferries were given a stiff test by the citron Kegresses. Wherever possible, jungle tracks were used to maintain progress. Eventually, the expedition reached the shores of the Indian Ocean. Hart now wanted to drive to the South Pole, but was dissuaded from this. Instead, he planned an expedition to Central Asia. This was to be mounted in early 1931, with one group starting from Syria, while another set out from Tientsin in China. The Syrian group initially found the going comparatively easy, as they passed through Iraq and Iran and then into Afghanistan. Indeed, it was not until the cars reached the Himalayas that they faced a real challenge. Undeterred, they began to penetrate these hostile mountains. Crossing raging torrents on the local bridges was a real test of nerves. Indeed, it was not a journey for anyone suffering from a fear of heights. The expedition's mechanics were kept hard at work, and eventually the vehicles had to be broken down into parts in order to get them through one especially difficult mountain pass. Once through the pass, the vehicles were reassembled. The party now enjoyed a brief rest. The vehicles then went on their way once more. Soon, they reached the snow line. The half-tracks coped well with the snow, but they did have to use their winches to haul themselves up slopes. They then began to descend and had to face the problem of coping with thawing snow. Once through the Himalayas, they found themselves confronted by yet more mountains, the seemingly endless ranges of the Pamirs. Eventually, they got through these and entered the plains of Central Asia, deep in today's Western China. Here they halted to await the arrival of the China group from Twentieth. This group experienced difficulties of another type. At the time, China was gripped by civil war, as Premier Chiang Kai-shek battled with his communist rivals. Government troops were often unwilling to allow the expedition to proceed. Only after much persuasion did they relent, but grisly signs of the civil war were plentiful, and group members had to be on their guard. The cars also had their share of physical obstacles to overcome. The primitive Chinese ferries proved to be remarkably resilient. Eventually, on the 7th of October 1931, the two groups were reunited after 7 months on the road. Both now drove to Peking, arriving in February 1932. Here they were given a ceremonial welcome by the French legation after having completed an extraordinary journey. The success of the Citroën Kegresse prompted armies, especially the Germans, to make extensive use of half-tracks during the Second World War. Indeed, the war saw motor vehicles operating in every climate. They supported the armies in every type of terrain. Perhaps their most spectacular achievement was overcoming the mountains separating Burma from China in order to take supplies to the Chinese forces fighting the Japanese. After the war, epic motor journeys continued. On the 1st of June 1951, Briton Alan Hess embarked on a drive around the world. He was supported by an aircraft lent by the Dutch airline KLM. The team's Austin car was driven down to Italy and then flown across the Mediterranean to the Middle East. The next leg by air took them to India, where they drove across the subcontinent from Bombay to Calcutta. From here, the car was flown to Los Angeles on America's west coast. They now set out to drive across America to New York. From here, they were to motor to Montreal in Canada before flying home across the Atlantic to Scotland. They returned to London on the 22nd of June, just 3 weeks after they had set out. Excluding flights, the car had traveled some 9,000 miles, an average of well over 400 miles a day. But other challenges remained, notably the jungles of Central and South America. These were tackled by a new breed of four-wheel drive vehicles. But more traditional forms of traction sometimes had to come to their rescue. Nevertheless, they demonstrated that motor vehicles could go almost everywhere. Monte Carlo, that traditional playground of the rich, has since 1911 been the venue of another type of long-distance motor journey, international rally. The Monte Carlo rally was at its zenith during the 50s and 60s. Conditions, however, can be tough. Indeed, in 1965, because of a snow blizzard, only 22 cars out of 237 starters actually completed the course. But those who did reach Monte Carlo at the end of such an exhausting journey could justly feel that they had achieved something. Yet other rallies are very much more demanding. Notable is the annual Paris to Dakar rally, which takes the contestants across the Sahara Desert. Fatalities are not unusual. Another severe test of both the cars and their navigators is the East African safari, which takes the cars on a tour of the bush of Kenya. Many fail to reach the capital, Nairobi. South America, too, has its rallies. The roads vary from metalled to mere dirt tracks. The cars provide much excitement for communities living in the hinterlands, but their crews have to endure numerous punctures. The longest motor rally ever staged was the 1977 London to Sydney, Australia contest, which was sponsored by Singapore Airlines. The cars covered every form of terrain, passing through no less than 19 countries. The drivers did, however, have the opportunity to relax during the various stages by sea. The winning car eventually arrived in Sydney, having covered over 19,000 miles in just 46 days. But the rally has never been repeated. Despite the skill and endurance of the modern epics, it is the adventures of the early days of motoring which really catch the imagination. One of the greatest of these will be commemorated in 1997, when several veterans again drive from Peking to Paris, 90 years after the original epic.